Ducks Unlimited, we've been active in Montana for a number of years. For many of you that aren't familiar with Ducks Unlimited, we've been around since 1937. And initially, most of our efforts were restoring and protecting wetlands up in the Canadian prairies. We recognized on the tail end of the Dust Bowl, we recognized that there were issues in places like Prairie Canada, which is really the heart of a lot of North America's duck production. We recognized there were issues up there that weren't addressed with programs like we have here in the U.S. A lot of the USDA programs were starting to evolve, Soil Conservation Service, things like that. So from 1937 until we started our U.S. operation in 1984, so fairly recently, most of our money went to Canada. We started working a little bit in Mexico in 1976. But since 1984, we've been very active. And in fact, starting in 1984, that was our first Ducks Unlimited project in the state of Montana. Our first regional office was Bismarck, North Dakota. That's still the regional office for Montana. And I'm located actually just south of Elliston, up the Little Blackfoot, a few miles. So I work statewide. We've got 5 staff total, 2 fundraising folks. One helps put on the banquet. I'll put a little pitch in for our Helena banquet. It's Friday night, tomorrow night, over at the Civic Center. Barry Allen is a fundraising fellow. We've got Chris Hildebrandt, who's a major donor, cultivator, and then we've got 3 conservation staff. Myself, Abby Dresser, who you'll see in this presentation, I know many of you know. And then we just hired a new farm bill biologist. We've got a program with the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, that I'll talk about here in a bit. We just hired a new fellow that is coming on board to replace Brett Dorek, who worked for us and went back to graduate school and now is back in Montana working for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So you can see here, we've got about 500 projects statewide. Obviously not 500 dots there, a lot of overlap, and we didn't clutter up the map too much. But very active throughout the state. But as you'll notice during my presentation, Blaine, Phillips, Valley, and Sheridan counties, that's really some of our focus areas. That's our breeding grounds, the best of the best of North America's waterfowl breeding habitat up there. So obviously the things that we do, and I'll show you in this presentation, it's not just ducks, but hundreds of wildlife species, and especially birds. There's a lot going on, a lot of overlap, and I think you'll appreciate some of the maps and some of the science that goes into identifying these areas and then the overlap that occurs, not only for waterfowl, but also a lot of these grassland obligate birds. So, wetlands and the work that Ducks Unlimited does not only affects wildlife, but we've also got issues and different focuses that are what I would call peripheral benefits. Things like that's a teepee ring. I don't know how many of you have seen teepee rings out on site, but it's really, for me, it's a very spiritual experience to see those out on the ground. You see a lot of evidence of old buffalo wallows out there. This particular rock you can see there, it's been shined up. That was buffalo. That was actually taken up in North Dakota, but buffalo used to rub against those. So there's a lot of history out there. So our projects are influencing that, and then also it influences people. It influences people out in the landscape, and arguably our most important partner out on the ground is the private landowner, is the rancher that's trying to make a living, and we can help them develop what I call a future vision of what they want to see happen for themselves, their operation, and future generations, and we can help them achieve that through some of these programs and create that win-win effect. So what makes Montana so special for ducks? You don't really think, your first reaction isn't, Montana is a big duck state. You think of North and South Dakota and the prairies. But actually, Montana is the number 3 duck producer in the U.S. behind North Dakota, South Dakota. Montana is number 3. Very important for ducks and disproportionately important for northern pintail, which pintail, if you follow duck population numbers continent-wide, when we get wet periods and all these other species rebound and mallards and teal and everything take off because we've got these great wetland conditions, northern pintail continue to seem to lag. Last year, mallard populations were up 51% over long-term averages. pintail were down 34. It was one of the only species that saw a decrease in time, and I'll explain some of that, why those reasons are. But Montana is very important. Obviously, big prairies, not the density of ducks and nesting areas that we have in places like North and South Dakota, but regardless, very important. Shortgrass prairies, temporary or ephemeral wetlands, very important habitat. And this is the impact that we have, that duck production, these are actually, each one of these dots is a band return, mostly from hunters. Of ducks that were banded, we know they were banded as juveniles, as young of the year in Montana when they put the bands on those in Montana. So we figure either they were hatched in Montana or they walked a heck of a long way as flightless young to get here. So, but you look at that, the Canadian prairies, obviously here in the state, there's going to be some band returns. Great Salt Lake, Central Valley of California, look at that. We've got mallard down here in the green squares, pintail in the purple, teal in the blue, diving ducks in the red, Texas Gulf Coast, Mississippi Alluvial Valley. And what's really impressive to me, and probably not too impressive to folks who follow some of the long shorebird migrations that go down to Patagonia and elsewhere, but teal species in the Yucatan and the northern tip of South America, pretty impressive. And those are ducks that are produced in Montana. So we've got quite a ripple effect across the continent. So how did all this topography and this geology occur? Back about 7,000 years ago was our last big glacial event. And that glacier was up here around Hudson Bay. It pushed down to the south and southwest and basically ended about here. For those of you that know geology, it's basically a long terminal moraine. And that glacier stopped and it melted. And it created, because of the debris that was pushed by that glacier, you get a lot of what we now call prairie pothole wetlands. So, and that is, you can see this hits just the northeast corner of Montana up in Sheridan County, and you'll see that on some of the data that I'll show here in a little bit. But also Blaine and Phillips and Valley counties up in there too. We've got some of the grasslands. Part of the beauty of that glacier didn't leave us with very productive soils. And really that's been the salvation of that area, because it isn't looked at as great farm ground. Very rocky, very thin soils. So having that poor soils with that topography that supports wetlands has been just a big plus for ducks. So again, glaciation, you can see how this glacier came down. We had the big ice sheets coming down. We had several smaller glaciations. And many of you know how glaciers work. But this is what we get. This is some of the best, and it is the best of North America's prairie pothole duck breeding habitat. When you look out there and you see more water than grass in a lot of places, that's incredible. And big blocks of intact grasslands. We've seen that as ducks go out on the landscape and nest, many ducks will nest up to 2 miles from brood-rearing wetlands, which when you're 24 to 48 hours old and you're this big and you're yellow and fuzzy and you've got to walk through all this, you are subject to predation. Very, very difficult to make your way through open areas that have been fragmented by, say, row crop agriculture and other human disturbances. So you look here, we've got the duck nest, we've got some really nice wetlands out here. I want to tell you a quick story. When I was working for the Fish and Wildlife Service in North Dakota back in the late 80s, I had the job of tracking ducklings and hens with directional antennas and radio marked birds. So I'm out one Sunday morning. We had a hen on a nest, and we had gone in right after hatch. We took a few of the ducklings. We put some micro transmitters on them that actually had little thermistors on so we could detect whether they were alive or dead based on the heat. The hen was also radioed. I'm sitting along the road, sun's coming up, and all of a sudden, you got a little pulse. It's a beep, beep, beep. And I'd have it on the nest, and I knew as soon as that sound stopped, either she was walking right at me or she was moving. And sure enough, I'm sitting along this county road, and oh, she's off the nest. She's moving. Boom, she takes off. So I get on, I fire up the truck, I chase her down this black, this dirt road. Get down, she went about 2.5 miles to a wetland. And she's surrounded by wetlands. I thought, man, that's strange. She goes in there. She spent about 20 minutes. Boom, she flies back. So I'm trying to get a fix on her and track her with this directional antenna. She goes back to the nest. I'm switching through frequencies. I'm checking the ducklings are still there. All of a sudden, oh, they're off the nest again. And here they come up to the county road. And boy, she comes up to the edge of the road and looks right, looks left. Boop, 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 boop. Her and the brood go across. And they went about 2.25 miles to that brood rearing wetland. We went out there later and took samples from several wetlands in that area where she went. She actually passed up wetlands to get to this particular wetland. And that wetland was the most productive wetland, aquatic invertebrate production-wise, of any of those wetlands. So she was an experienced hen, and she knew what she was doing. And I'll talk a little bit in the second half of the talk about how important these aquatic invertebrate resources are to not only the egg-producing hens, but also the young. So, but this is what we're starting to see over time, is this fragmentation. We go from intact, partially fragmented, and all of a sudden you get into a situation like you have in the lower right, with increasing fragmentation. If you're a duck and you're attracted into these wetland basins, and all you have to nest is maybe this little edge, and all of this, if you can't tell, that's all plowed up ground. If you're a fox, you're a coyote, skunk, raccoon, it's pretty darn easy to just make a loop around each one of those wetlands and find those duck nests. So obviously, in a big landscape like this, a duck nest can be almost anywhere. When you start getting down into this more fragmented habitat, it's much easier for predators to find those duck nests. And you'll see here in a little bit what kind of challenges a female duck has in getting a nest off. So, and we typically, some of our latest figures, we lose about 10,000 acres of native prairie and shrublands annually here in Montana. You wouldn't think that they'd be breaking those out. You know, I've always looked at it, you know, as human beings and kind of the Western European, farmers. You look at it and you say, oh gosh, you know, we've been on the face of the Montana landscape farming for 150 plus years. We've basically, if there's good farm ground out there, we found it and we farmed it. It just keeps going. So some of the challenges out there are to try to keep some of these intact marginal crop grounds in place. Our mantra going into the last farm bill was farm the best, conserve the rest. We don't want to pay $20 a loaf for a loaf of bread, but we also understand that, hey, certain areas are better off as ranch ground, as beef production, and as native prairie than it is on very, very marginal farm ground. So how do we offset these losses? What does Ducks Unlimited bring to the table that is important in the big scheme of things? Obviously, biology, that's what I do. We have engineers on staff in Bismarck. When I have a project that includes creating or restoring wetlands, I can pull surveyors and engineers in. Land protection, which I'll talk about in detail here in a few minutes. Purchasing land and or conservation easements. Very, very important tool. Public policy, arguably none of this stuff, none of these programs would be around if we didn't have good public policy that authorizes programs and funds programs. So very, very important. Obviously research, where should we be working? And when we do projects, getting that feedback loop of, okay, how did that project work out and should we do it again? Or should we modify our approach and do something different or maybe work in a different place? And then funding. As I mentioned, Friday night, tomorrow night is the Ducks Unlimited banquet. We've got about 40 of those fundraising events around Montana and about 600,000 members nationwide. So those members are supporters. It might be the baseline $35 basic membership, or we've got very large donors. In fact, we had one fellow out of Illinois that recently gave us a gift. It was a single gift over 5 years, $25 million. It's the biggest gift that Ducks Unlimited's ever received. So we're really excited, and that gift is targeted towards the prairies. I always joke that we're the red-haired stepchildren of the prairies behind North and South Dakota, but we'll get $5 million of that over the next 5 years. So very, very important funding for this kind of work. And then partnerships. And I'll talk a little bit about the partnerships. You know, we can't do it alone. You've got really 3 conservation staff on the ground. And, you know, to get that work done, we've got to be able to leverage, we've got to be able to work together, and we've got a lot of great partners. And I apologize to Larry. Do I have Department of Transportation? No, I got DEQ in here. So Larry's going to give me heck after the talk. But just gives you a flavor of the folks that we've worked with, the agencies and the organizations that we've worked with. And I really feel, you know, like Don said in my introduction, I've been doing this now for 21 years with Ducks Unlimited. I really feel Montana's got one of the best teams of folks out on the ground right now to get this kind of work done when we look at all these different players and really an altruistic, all for one and one for all kind of attitude. So really the time is ripe to get a lot of these projects on the ground and get a lot of this country conserved. So one of the, I guess, epitomes in my mind of how partnership can work is what we call our revolving land strategy. And revolving lands is really just kind of the model. We locate habitat. If you look at the top here, we find a good habitat that's at risk, high waterfowl values. Typically, it's been on the market for a while, so we're not competing with local ranchers. It's been on the market. No one's very interested. We'll purchase that from a willing seller. We'll do the habitat restoration, and we'll do the infrastructure. So, for instance, just last spring, we redid some stock water infrastructure. We drilled a new well with Petrie Drilling out of Turner. We drilled a new well on our flat property, put in the water lines. We'll be finishing that up this spring once the frost is out of the ground. And so really, when a rancher buys this, we'll hold this property for 2 to 3 years, have the easement on it that allows ranching, but doesn't allow row crop agriculture, and then we'll sell it to a local rancher. So really, when the rancher gets it, it's an operating, top-notch ranch. So it's a really exciting program. We've done about 11,000 acres in Montana to date. You can see this is Phillips County here. We're up along what we call the High Line. And we've got properties, Henderson, this is the Canadian border right up here. We've got our Matulka property. We just sold Matulka and Anderson last year. We got our flat property. That's where we just put in the water lines. We did an easement with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. I'll talk about that in a minute. And this one's fairly new, so I don't have the boundaries on it yet, but that's called our Sure property, and I'll talk about that one as well. So this is a Sure property. We acquired it last year. Again, it had been on the market. I always laugh. I go out to some of these sites, and they've been on the market so long that you look, and there's something underneath a bunch of folded over grass, and that's the old real estate sign from like 15 years ago, you know. So anyway, beautiful stuff. This is actually Bowdoin National Wildlife Refuge. For those of you that have birded out there, Malta sits way over here to the northwest. This is Beaver Creek Waterfowl Production Area, another federal area. This is Beaver Creek itself flowing down. This is actually the old Missouri River channel prior to the glacier coming through. The glacier pushed it to the south where it is now. But now it's just Beaver Creek. It's just a tiny little creek. But this is 1,215 acres of just wonderful riparian habitat. There's a photo here. I'll flash back and forth here. This is an aerial view. So again, Bowdoin National Wildlife Refuge up here. This is looking basically northwest. But you can see this really nice native shortgrass prairie in here. Real seasonal wetlands, highly productive for aquatic invertebrates. Just beautiful stuff. So that's the Sure property. We've also owned the flat property for several years. And we completed that conservation easement. Typically, we do an easement with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That's kind of our model. Very rancher-friendly easement, does not restrict grazing in any way, shape, or form. The FWP easement is similar, but it also requires a management plan for grazing, which the Fish and Wildlife Service easement does not, and it provides for permanent public access, which for most, if not all of us, is extremely important. Being able to get out on the land, and I've said before that, you know, probably folks, I'm 54 years old. Folks my age and older, you know, we're going to have places to hunt for the next, you know, for the rest of our lives. Really what we're doing there is we're looking at trying to provide opportunities for the next generations coming down the line. So very, very important. It's something that I've been working on to try to get into all of our easements, because once we sell these, We put all of our properties into block management, but once we relinquish that control and we sell that property, public access is not included on most of them. Flat property is the exception. So very important. This one's actually 14 miles south of Dodson. For those of you, it's north of the TNC Matador Ranch. We actually looked at it because the runoff from flat goes down towards TNC's Matador Ranch. And as you break out that native prairie, a lot of those salts that are naturally in the soils get mobilized with row crop agriculture. They get put into solution and they start flowing downstream, and then they start building up, and you get saline seeps and some of these other challenges. So revolving lands, 12,000 acres. To be quite honest, those are pin dots on the landscape. We're not going to save the world 1,000 acres at a time. It's important work, but really the spin-offs are, and I've told many of our partners, they say, oh, can we do this out on DU's property? It's like, we're building the schoolhouse. We're building this training center for you to be able to showcase your projects, and landowners, and justifiably so, they're hesitant to jump right into a perpetual conservation easement. When you figure that their land is the way they pay the bills, they pay the mortgage, they put the kids through school, it's a kid's inheritance, the whole 9 yards, you can't just say, oh, well, do what we feel is the right thing. No, you got to incentivize that. But people are a little nervous, and justifiably so. So as we have these different properties, I try to showcase as many of these different conservation easement options as possible, and then be very transparent with the easement documents, the values that we got for putting an easement on, the different programs that can provide infrastructure improvements, stock water, fencing, things like that. And we can get some really great results putting those projects on the ground and letting people see them. And this is some of the spin-off here. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service easements last year. Now remember, over the course of 5 years of revolving land, we did over 11,000 acres. Just last year alone, we did 7,200 acres in concert with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with their easements. So we haven't had to buy the land. The landowners are doing it themselves, which is really a beauty in and of itself, because local people are taking control of their future and their family's future and doing these easements on their own. They're recognizing through some of the examples with revolving lands that, hey, this could work for me, and it's now part of their overall ranch operation plan. So, Partners for Wildlife. This is a fella, Don Fast. He's up along the Milk River, up towards Glasgow. Great guy. Don doesn't want to do a conservation easement, but he wants to stay in business. He does a little farming, a little ranching. And we're out there. This is Lauren Rupert. He's the Partners for Wildlife Private Lands Coordinator he's out of South Phillips County. And so Lauren and I meet with these guys, and we try to gauge, again, getting that future vision from guys like Don Fast and saying, hey, what do you want to get out of this? How can we help you? And when you come in with that attitude into a community, because we're outsiders. I mean, really, unless you're 2 or 3 generations you've been in Phillips County, you're an outsider. So being able to come in and bring something to that community as opposed to going in there and asking them to give something up. Hey, set your land aside because it's the right thing to do. No, we want to do voluntary, incentive-based conservation. The other alternative to voluntary incentive-based is regulatory. And nobody wants to be told what to do. Nobody wants the Endangered Species Act, that club coming down on top of them. So if we can make this voluntary, boy, we're just so much farther ahead in the long run. I wanted to talk a little bit. Don asked me to talk because we've got the display out here on hunting and fishing. I wanted to talk a little bit about the role that hunting and fishing plays. And one of the things that's required, one of the pieces of paper that's required to hunt ducks anywhere in the U.S. is a federal migratory bird stamp. Anyone over the age of 16 has to have a federal migratory bird stamp. It recently went up. I think it was last year was the first year it went from $15 to $25. It hadn't been raised since the early 1990s. But it started off in 1934, and the cost of that was $1. So a fellow named Ding Darling did the artwork for the stamp. Since then, and I'm just amazed, $900 million has been raised through that stamp. And it's not just for hunters. A lot of places when you get out to California, the East Coast, if you're going out onto a national wildlife refuge to bird, I'm sure many of you have done that, you've got to have that or you got to pay an entrance fee. I know I've used my federal duck stamp to get on the National Bison Range up by Polson. It's mostly duck hunters, but it doesn't have to be. 6 million acres, and I forget what that is. It's $30 an acre, right? Yeah, well, yeah, it's fairly cheap, but as far as square mileage, I mean, it's just incredible the footprint of this. And this is probably, you know, in Ducks Unlimited, we always brag 86 cents of every dollar goes on the ground, which is great for any nonprofit. That's a great match ratio and a great delivery goal. 86 cents, 83 cents, we kind of hover in there. This one, 98%. I mean, show me a federal program that's that efficient. I mean, 98 cents of every dollar goes on the ground. It's probably 2 cents of every stamp goes to printing the stamp and the rest goes on the ground. So really, I encourage you, if you're not a purchaser of duck stamps, it's one of the best ways. And obviously, and as I'll point out here in a little bit, it's not just about ducks. It's about a ton of other birds. And in Montana, we get about $800,000 a year. That's actually, this year it's doubled. They're able to tap in addition to migratory bird stamp dollars, they get a federal excise tax on foreign firearm and ammunition sales. So if you buy a Glock, go out and buy a bunch of Glocks and support ducks. But right now, it's actually gone up. I think it's closer to $2 million for this coming year. So it's great. You know, we're building a lot of this energy. We're getting a lot of landowners interested. So the timing is right to be able to bump that up past that $800,000 mark. And similarly, the state of Montana has a duck stamp. That one, I believe, is what? $6.50. I bought one last week, but it's no longer a stamp. It's actually just a permit. But they've used that as well. And you look at some of these acreages and the categories, restoration and enhancement or creation, so what I call the dirt turning projects, management of those wetlands, and I'll talk a little bit about management in a bit, and then permanent protection of wetlands and associated grassland. So some pretty impressive figures. They haven't been active with that. I believe it started around 1990, so that program hasn't been around as long as the federal duck stamp program, but for as long as it's been on the ground and the relatively smaller dollars that are charged for that stamp, it's been very impressive on the great work that Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has been able to do. And this is a footprint of those, where those project sites are. Again, you'll see the reoccurring theme, whether it's Ducks Unlimited, Fish and Wildlife Service, Nature Conservancy is very active up there. No matter who the agency or organization is, you'll see the reoccurring theme of Blaine, Phillips, Valley, and Sheridan counties of really popping. And you'll see this, see that in a bit when I show some specific optimal habitat for bird slides. So, NAWCA, the North American Wetland Conservation Act, another very, very critical program. And when I talk about public policy, I'll mention the importance of keeping NAWCA authorized and the funding strong for NAWCA. It started in 1990. It's actually the funding arm of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. In Montana, since 1990, $123 million has been put on the ground. About 23 million of that has been actual NAWCA dollars. The other dollars, the 100 million, has been non-federal funds that are leveraged through the NAWCA program. So you'll see that leveraging factor in here, whether it's Ducks Unlimited programs like NAWCA, are very critical to kind of parlay your money, work together in partnership, and get these programs on the ground. 34 project areas statewide, and within that, hundreds of projects. We just submitted the Highline NAWCA 7. It's our 7th go-around. Standard grant right now, they've actually bumped it up. You can put in for $2 million. We've still done $1 million grants. You've got to have at least a 1-to-1 match. So you got to have $1 million of match to even be able to put in for $1 million grant. So $1 million is pretty much what we can handle as a partnership at a crack, developing that match. That was just submitted about 4 days ago. So we'll be looking towards that. Montana is typically ranked at the top of the nation just because, well, for several reasons, but most of which is we get some great dollar figures where you might protect an acre of ground in Montana through a Fish and Wildlife Service easement For $200, it costs you about $2,000 down in in South Dakota, just because of the land values and the influence that corn has on crop ground prices. USDA, this is a program that we've been doing for the last 6 years. And this is for those of you that don't know her, Abby Dresser. She's my right-hand woman. She works out of the NRCS office in Bozeman. That's their state office down there. And what we recognize, so 5, 6, 7, I've been in Montana now 11 years. 5, 6, 7 years ago, we were getting funding for a program. At the time, it was called Wetland Reserve Program, or WRP. Now they've changed it, Wetland Reserve Easement, WRE. So same thing, basically different farm bill, different name. Before Abby came on, we were looking at that program, and we'd get typically 10 to 12 million. One year, the last year before Abby came on, we got $12 million authorized from Washington, D.C. for USDA, for Natural Resource Conservation Service, to acquire wetland reserve easements. We ended up turning 10 million of that back to D.C. unspent. That's $10 million of conservation buying power that could have been working in Montana, could have been going to people like ranchers, farmers, folks that own wetland habitat, and instead, it went back to D.C. unspent. I'm sure it was probably spent in another state. Bottom line for us, it wasn't spent here. Why was that? WRE, or at the time WRP, is a very due diligence intensive program. So if you go to your local county office and you say, hey, I want to do a WRE, they're going to be like, oh boy, you know, this is a lot of work. There are appraisals, there are surveys, and typically a USDA program, you can fill out a few sheets of paper and get an EQIP, an Environmental Quality Incentive Program project for a well improvement. And boy, it's wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, and you're out the door and you got your improvement. With WRE, it's about a 2-year process to get it done. So a lot of the local offices, A, didn't have the expertise, and B, were daunted by the amount of work. So we said, hey, what if Ducks Unlimited, in cooperation with NRCS, brings somebody on that can help deliver these programs? We'll train them up, we'll have them very knowledgeable on the program, and then an individual county can give them a call and say, hey, we need Abby. And Abby goes up there, she'll survey the project, she'll fill out the paperwork, and shepherd it through the system. And so it's really been working great. And you look at some of these successes here on the ground. So in just a few years, 29,000 acres statewide, $10 million in funding for easements alone. And that leverage rate is always big. And again, you know, having that, 3 to 1, 4 to 1 is really, really good. For every dollar we get, we produce $4 worth of conservation impacts. This one is actually 25 to 1. So for every dollar Ducks Unlimited puts into that, and for me, that's important because I look at the average person that I work with that's a Ducks Unlimited volunteer. They're giving up their $35, or maybe they're a bronze sponsor for $250 a year. I feel personally responsible to spend that money as wisely as I can. So to get that kind of impact, you think, okay, somebody gives us $35 as an annual membership, and we're able to parlay that into 3, 4, 5 acres of conservation buying power. Man, that's big. That's something that you can stand in front of anybody and be proud of. And here's what's on the agenda. So we've got 80,000 acres of projects in the hopper. So incredible number. Again, this, as people get more and more comfortable with these programs and we get word out there, we provide delivery capabilities, we're looking at more and more impacts. And 8,800 acres of those are up in that Blaine, Phillips, and Sheridan counties areas alone. So that's, again, that priority complex. Obviously, that's where Ducks Unlimited focuses. We may have other projects down on the Madison River, all across the state. We had a beautiful one that we dedicated last summer up on the Flathead River up near Dixon in the Mission Valley, right across from the National Bison Range. But that highline area, that prairie pothole habitat up on the highline is really the focus for Ducks Unlimited, where we're going to have, science tells us, we're going to have the biggest impact on waterfowl populations. So wetland management, the old saying, if you build it, they will come, but you also got to maintain it. It's like buying a house. If you never redo the roof when it needs it, you never paint it, you never do the upkeep, the house is going to go away. And it's the same thing with created wetlands. Mother Nature, when you get a prairie pothole wetland, there's natural wet-dry cycles with climate shift and things like that. That can take care of itself. Sometimes you can help it out with maybe some grazing. Disturbance is what wetlands thrive on. So disturbance can be temporarily drying out or at least getting down to what we call a moist soil condition. It may be grazing that. It may be, if you got a big cattail stand, we might look at doing some dormant season burning. So disturbance is really what keeps wetlands productive. You think about that. If you burn a stand of grass or cattails, there's this huge release of nutrients into the soil. And boom, you open up that canopy. It's just like forest management. You open up that canopy, and those plants that have been shaded out by cattail, and I'm talking a big monotypic stand of cattail, been shaded out for years and years, they're able to take off and grow. Now, some species, as we all know, if you're a marsh wren, you still want to have. It's not saying, hey, we got to knock down all this stuff. But regular management, select scientifically based management is important. So this is Canyon Ferry, pond number 4. I'm sure most of you have been down past Townsend. It's a very southern tip. It's the westernmost pond that you see right off the road. This was very sterile. You look at that ground, and basically it's mudflat. And these are all rough fish here. Those are all carp, non-native carp that got in there, and A, they'll graze down the plants just like a cow will out in a pasture, and B, they get the water that's turbid. You've probably seen carp, and they get out there and they roll during breeding season, and that turbidity prevents light penetration and prevents plants from growing. So they're grazing them off and then preventing them from regrowing. So Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, in concert with Ducks Unlimited and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, said, hey, let's pull this down. Let's pull these impoundments down. For those of you that don't know, these were already originally created, those ponds at the south end of Canyon Ferry, as dust abatement measures for the city of Townsend. So when the wind comes in, Townsend was getting these huge dust storms, so they said, hey, let's build these ponds, and it's not going to blow. Well, again, stable water levels for years and years and years, and all of a sudden it's like, hey, the birds just aren't using them like they used to. So we did the drawdown, and then this past summer was the first growing season. The plants grew up in that moist soil environment, and then water was applied. So you start to see some more of this emergent vegetation, some curly dock out there. You can see some hardstem bulrush. So those plants are coming back in, and plants are not only providing forage in terms of seed, but they're also substrate for aquatic invertebrates. Aquatic invertebrates need some kind of cover out there, and typically the more cover in the water, the higher the productivity for aquatic invertebrates. So public policy, I've mentioned a few of these. NAWCA, North American Wetland Conservation Act, the Farm Bill, some of Abby's work that she does. Clean Water Act is another one. Clean Water Act, we've had several Supreme Court decisions, the Swank decision and the Rapanos decision, that said, hey, waters that are not connected to a waterway, a river or a stream, a navigable river or a stream, are not protected under the Clean Water Act. And the Clean Water Act actually came into law under President Nixon in 1972, under a Republican administration, which is usually typically very conservative. Came in then, obviously, many of you, looking around the room, were around and conscious of what's going on in the nation in 1972. Very important. We had a lot of environmental activism back then. So this was very, very important. 2 subsequent Supreme Court decisions, Swank and Rapanos, basically said, hey, unless these wetlands are connected to a waterway, they're not covered under the Clean Water Act or the 404 Act, which is enforced by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So that left a lot of the nation's, a majority of the nation's wetlands at risk. And again, not that we look towards the regulatory club, but it's definitely a slowing down of wholesale destruction of wetlands. We prefer to have that incentive, voluntary, incentive-based kind of effort where landowners want to do it, but it is a additional measure to help keep wetlands intact. At the state level, and all of you are aware, we've got a legislative session going on right now. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks funding is one of the biggest focuses for Ducks Unlimited during the session. The last session, we have programs, and I'm sure many of you hunt and fish, Habitat Montana, which is usually about $12 million a year for access, for hunting, fishing, the Fishing Access Program, Bighorn Sheep Research, Migratory Bird, Upland Game Bird Enhancement Program. All of those are wrapped up in House Bill 5 typically. When that came out of the House, the full House vote, the approval was for a goose egg for all of those projects. And it's like, and those are not tax dollars. We're not saving the taxpayer a penny. Those are sportsmen's dollars. Those are your dollars if you hunt and fish and buy license fees. So that was important, and we got that turned around. But there were moratoriums, a 2-year moratorium on no-fee title access. And again, I think I'm going to have plenty of places to hunt, and most of you will for the rest of your lives. It's really looking at the kids and grandkids, and there's getting to be more and more people. There's more people leasing up land. So being able to get out and recreate and enjoy the outdoors in addition to protecting the habitat is going to be a really key thing. Access, both through Habitat Montana as well as stream access, very important. And then we haven't had any in this current session, but historically there have been assaults on easements. Easements shouldn't be perpetual. Well, you don't get any tax breaks if you donate an easement. And really it's key. If you're looking at doing a conservation easement, at least from a organizational and an agency standpoint, you'd like to see those easements perpetual. So keeping that. And again, that legislation was defeated 2 sessions ago, but we've seen less and less. And groups like Montana Association of Land Trusts, very instrumental. Glenn Marks is the head of that program. Very instrumental in getting that word out, networking with legislators, and it's a role that all of you can play in talking to your legislators regarding some of these important programs. So now, without further ado, let's talk about birds. I think all of us are bird fanatics to one extent or another. It's really a neat opportunity to be able to do this and not only impact people and kind of get into strategy of how conservation actually works, but to look at how the birds use these landscapes. And this is, I think many of you have probably seen this. I know I showed this in my last talk. It's been almost 2 years ago to the day that I was giving a presentation to the Audubon Society here. But this is what we affectionately call the thunderstorm map. Has nothing whatsoever to do with weather. It simply resembles a Doppler radar image of a thunderstorm moving across the northern Great Plains. But what this is these are random plots that are selected throughout the Highline. This, again, is the Canadian border here. And these data extend up into Canada, over into North Dakota. This is the Montana portion of it. We look at that and we say, okay, we're going to take random, what they call 4 square mile plots. We're going to survey those. Fish and Wildlife Service heads us up. We're going to survey that, and then we're going to extrapolate over the landscape, and that's going to give us a science that says, hey, these hot spots here, Sheridan County, Blaine and Phillips counties, and a little bit of, I'd call them cool spots in Valley County and down in South Phillips, that's where science dictates that if we put money on the ground, if we're working with landowners, trying to keep ranching strong on the ground, that's where, if we put our money there, that's where the science is telling us we're going to get our best bang for the buck. So that is what we call the thunderstorm map. We've got about 10 years of data. North and South Dakota, they've got about close to 30 years of data there. So we're kind of new to the whole mix. But you look at that, and then you start layering in these different GIS layers. Fortunately for us in Montana, as far as conservation goes, this yellow here is BLM. The little blue dots, state DNRC ground. So really what we're looking at is filling in some of these white private landowners and trying to get, again, those voluntary incentive-based programs. You look here, these pie charts down here, black is the amount of privately owned ground, and then the colored bars are the amount of publicly owned ground. So you look at Iowa, I'm guessing maybe an occasional state park somewhere is all they have in Iowa. And they've also lost about 99% of their wetlands in the state of Iowa. Used to be a very productive area, one of the most productive wetland areas on earth, tall grass prairie, but we've effectively farmed that, and 98% of that is private ground. You start looking at Minnesota, 92, 90, 90. Montana, we've got just shy of half of our ground in the prairie pothole region of Montana is still in public ownership. So in a way that makes our job a lot easier, assuming the state land management agencies are in concert with us on saying, hey, these aren't going to be plowed up. These are going to have values, including ranching. There is mineral extraction up there, obviously, but also wildlife values, that we're going to look at these multiple uses and conserve the land accordingly. So that's our land ownership layer. And then we start looking at wetland and grassland. So gradually, we're layering all these things. We've got great, again, looking at Blaine, Phillips, Valley counties. You see green is 75 to 100% grass, so it's ranching country. It's the Montana cowboy out on the horse, doing the roundups, doing the branding. Up in here, we've lost a lot of that. It's more farm ground with a lot of wetlands. But Sheridan County, still very high value. But when you look, again, you can see not so much grass, but lots of wetlands. Up here, again, that glaciation that came down from the Hudson Bay area and created a lot of those wetlands out there. Very, very valuable to ducks when you start combining wetlands and grasslands to get those complexes. So, talking about some specific, and I'm going to leave ducks behind here for now, Baird sparrow. And many of you know that these species that I'm going to talk about, obviously there's some like, willets and things like that aren't seeing quite the drastic declines, but Baird sparrows obviously have gone way down. Some of the surveys, even though they're rough, we know that some of these declines of these grassland obligate birds have been 60, 70, 80% over time. So very important, but I want you to look, and if you remember the thunderstorm map and you look and see where our high priority areas are, look as I go through these slides. So we've got chestnut collared longspur, what pops? Blaine Phillips Valley. Lark bunting, what pops? Blaine Phillips Valley. Obviously you've got a little bit down there in the southwest. Long-billed curlew, holy smokes. I mean, those things are crazy up there in June. You'll be out, and they're so funny because you'll be walking along. If you're looking at the curlew, he'll da-da-da-da, they're sounding off. You turn your back, and they know. And all of a sudden, you kind of get them out of your periphery, and they just start cruising in on you. And then they'll pull up about 2 arm lengths away and chatter at you. And it's just great. So long-billed curlew, marble godwit. Look what's popping. And this is, so we've looked at these, and a lot of this work has been done by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Again, McCowan's longspur, Sprague's pipit. I mean, I think, and I'm sure several of you know more than I do about declines, but I've seen 83%. I've seen even higher numbers than that, declines since the 1960s. That's scary to me, and this is what's going to happen. I mean, we've seen what's happened with sage grouse in Montana, that we've tried to keep them off the endangered species list, but we've got some great programs. Again, that voluntary incentive, working with ranchers as opposed to threatening ranchers, and being able to say, hey, these are going to be the sage grouse of the next couple of decades if we're not careful. So doing what we can with these incentive-based programs versus saying, oh, now Sprague's pipit have declined 90%, we got to throw it on the endangered species list. Yes, sir. I would say not. Yeah, I would say that Sprague's pipit, you're probably looking at more falcons, and they're probably more experts here. But Sprague's pipit is, I call them the LBBs, the little brown birds. They're not typically, I always think more, despite it's our national symbol, I always think of bald eagles as more of a carrion eater and that sort of thing. So I would say, if anything, they're a smaller bird. They're probably not worth the investment by an eagle, but you'd be looking at more things like some of the merlins and the smaller accipiters and falcons would be predators on a Sprague's pipit. Really the bottleneck, and some of you may know quite a bit more than me, but the bottleneck is the wintering habitat down in the central highlands of Mexico. We've got some incredible losses of habitat down there. So really the summer range, and this extends, obviously it doesn't just end at this imaginary border, it extends up into Canada. But as far as the U.S. side of the border, This is the best of the best for Sprague's pipit in the lower 48. So very, very critical. But again, noticing that overlap with the 4 square mile plot and the waterfowl data. And so really the bottom line is what we're doing for ducks with waterfowl stamp and other funding sources is really good for a lot of these species. Will it? Again, what pops? Same thing. So what we did then is we condensed all of this and we looked at the what we call optimal habitats for 22 species. And these are kind of indicator species, ones that have a lot of overlap. We actually had bald eagle in this list. Does that really tell us a lot of a grassland obligate that's declined? No, it doesn't tell us a lot. So we teased out some of those. We narrowed the waterfowl field. This 22 species does include some waterfowl species. So we teased out, we kept green-winged teal in, and we pulled out gadwall, things like that. But basically looking at species that were representative of a guild of species. And so we could say, okay, optimal habitats for 22 species. And you look here, here's the Rocky Mountain front. So obviously we've got some pretty cool habitat out there, Sweetgrass Hills. But then you look at this. You look at South Phillips County, South Valley. This is that Bitter Creek area. That's a big BLM area. And then up here in northern Blaine and Phillips County. And again, over in Sheridan and down into, this is Roosevelt County here. So some really valuable habitat. And again, the science is pointing us in the direction of this is where we should be working if we're going to make the most effective use of the conservation dollar. And again, this is back, give you another look at that thunderstorm map. So, if you are a duck, especially if you're a hen or a duckling, life is not easy. And I want to talk a little bit about the life cycle, especially during the breeding season. We look at the importance of wetlands. Most of the diets of those species, if you're producing an egg, if you are a young duckling, you need aquatic invertebrates. And this slide here really well depicts, species like ruddy duck, 100% of the diet. And some of these species, you look at ruddies, they'll be feeding on aquatic invertebrates year round. They're very much of an aquatic invertebrate insectivore, if you will. But during the breeding season, a lot of these species, blue-winged teal will shift. So it's really neat. You get what's called, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with ecological terms, niche partitioning, where several different species of a bird or an animal can feed in the same general area, say a wetland, and not compete with one another. So say, for instance, a blue-winged teal, going to be a very shallow forager at different times of the year. And just by virtue of its body size, it can only tip up and reach down 3, 4, 5 inches. Versus a lesser scup, which is a diving species. So you got pintail that are out in seasonal wetlands. So you got all this niche partitioning going on. But the bottom line is, when a female is laying females, their diet, widgeon most of the year, are very much vegetarian. They don't hit aquatic invertebrates much at all. During the breeding season, they're up 40% of their diet is aquatic invertebrates. So very, very important. And those only come from those highly productive, typically shallow wetlands that we're trying to protect out on the prairies. Lots of energy here. Everybody's eating an egg. Crack it open, what is it? It's egg white. It's basically the standard for protein in the world. I mean, it's very, very nutritionally dense. And it's a yolk, which is even more calorically dense. We've got about 9 calories per gram in a yolk of energy. So you think about that, it is incredible. A ruddy duck female, will almost reproduce her body weight in egg mass in about 10 days. And that's the equivalent. I always like to, kind of anthropomorphize and relate it back to human beings. It's like having an 8-pound baby each day, ladies, for 10 consecutive days. Yeah, I see some winces. But you imagine, okay, you can't draw off your body reserves. I mean, if you're a ruddy duck and you're trying to do that in 10 days, you'd be a pile of dust at the end if you pulled strictly off of what you have in your body, or what we refer to as endogenous reserves. You've got to go to the outside. You've got to go to the invertebrates out in the habitat that you're in. And it takes time. So you're not only sitting on that nest, so the typical, we'll use a mallard. Mallard is about an egg a day for, say, a clutch size is 10. So she'll take a few days to build a nest bowl. She'll lay an egg a day for, say, 10 days. There you got 12 days in. Mallard incubation in most areas about 28 and a half days on the average. So you're close to a month of incubation. So you're already close to a month and a half by the time you build a nest, lay, and you get the eggs to hatch. So you're stuck on that nest for most of the day, subject to predators. Brood rearing for mallards is 58 days on the average. So once they're off, they're flightless for 2 months, and they got to have wetlands. You get a wetland that dries up, and they got to do an overland move. They're subject to being predated. So trying to keep all of that together and having a complex of good grasslands, high quality wetlands, very, very important for duck species. And this is the mortality associated with nesting females. So if you're a nesting female duck, you're 1 in 4 that you're going to die that during that breeding season. It's not good odds, but the odds are even worse when you're an egg, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. So this is Prairie, Canada, Parkland total, which is just north of the Prairie Pothole region. 26% chance of being predated. Very, very scary if you're a female duck. Fortunately, they don't know that. Renesting is an option. But you got to think about it. If you're a duck, your nest gets destroyed, and especially if it gets destroyed late in the season, you're up against the clock. So already the aquatic invertebrate boom has gone on. Most of what they're going to eat are the larval aquatic form. They're going to get that. They're not going to be picking them out of the air as they fly around. So that biomass in the wetland has gone down, and that's what the ducklings are dependent on. So if you go too late and you start adding up that 12 days plus 28 days plus 58 days, holy smokes, your little ducklings are still going to be flightless in late October when the Montana prairies are starting to get blizzards at times. So there's mechanisms in there. There are certain cues, bodily cues that they go through with protein intake that dictate whether or not they can make a nest. Typically, the renests are smaller, significantly smaller. If a 10-egg clutch is normal in a given area, you might be looking at 4 or 5 on a renest attempt. But they're still able, hopefully, to pull it off and get those birds in the flight stage before Mother Nature has everything freezing up. So ducks, we know the altricial young, like a robin that needs to be fed. Ducks are precocial, so they hatch off around day 28, say for a mallard, and then they'll dry off. She'll brood them. They do not thermoregulate well in the first week of life. So very, very high mortality if it gets cold, which, as we all know, we're prone to that in these northern latitudes. They're precocial, self-feeding. Like I said early in the talk, they can walk up to 2 miles to a suitable wetland, which is a heck of a lot when your feet are that little and you're about 2 ounces and fuzzy. They actually, as those of you that have been around ducklings or young chickens, they retain that little bit of a yolk sac on their chest, and they can continue to draw off that post-hatching. So there's a little bit of a grace period in there before they have to find those very productive wetlands and get into those aquatic invertebrate resources. But remarkable. You see these guys within 48 hours of hatching, and boy, they're out there, boop, 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 they're little vacuums. You know, they're picking up all these aquatic invertebrates, and they just know inherently how to forage. And the hen, what her key is to get them to the wetlands that she knows are productive, and then they've got to do their own thing. There's no feeding of the ducklings by the hen, by the mother. So brood survival, again, not good. In a wet year, so if you hatch early and it's a wet year on the prairies, you got a pretty darn good chance, but you still got, roughly a 28% chance of getting predated or dying of hypothermia. If it's a late hatch, it goes down significantly. Your odds are not even 50-50. In a dry year, it's even worse, and that's with an early hatch. You get a late hatch in a dry year, you might as well hang it up. And a lot of hens will. We get, there's kind of some theories, evolutionary theories in the waterfowl world of super hens that, get out there. But they know. They're experienced hens. They've been around for a long, long time. And they know where to breed, and they know when to call it quits. And there are years. The late 80s, when I worked up in North Dakota, extreme drought, and we couldn't even find hen mallards. We would put radios on them, and they just never nested. So we'd really have a hard time getting our sample size up to be able to do the radio telemetry that I talked about earlier. So canvasback mortality, and again, remember, these are uneducated birds. There's a lot of them, so a lot of times the hen can brood them. If there's too many of them, some of them will get exposed to the cold and die because the hen can't keep them warm with her body heat, and they're inexperienced. So a hawk or an owl comes over and wham, nails some on the ground. Those birds don't, I mean, they have somewhat of an instinct to run and hide, but there's a lot of them. In a target-rich environment, those predators do pretty well. As they get older and start to get more educated, they start to do much, much better. And they're bigger bodied, they thermoregulate better, so they're better off. And, you know, a lot of people contrast ducks and geese. You know, there's a distinct difference there. Obviously, with ducks, brood survival is about 50-50 in a lot of areas. Some areas are a lot worse. Some areas, including Montana, there's a lot of places that's more up around 75%. But geese are incredibly high, 3/4. Well, why is that? You know, geese, obviously, they are typically, we always like to think of them, but typically they are lifelong monogamous pairs. They're bigger birds. So you've got two adults, and they're able to fend off predators. You get a smaller, say a mink or even a raccoon, and one parent can distract them while the other one takes the brood. They can defend themselves. They're a little bigger. They're more of a grazer in most cases. You know, when you're looking at Canada geese, snow geese, they're grazing, so they're not subject to some of those wild swings of aquatic invertebrate food resource availability. So you've got a lot of differences there in the strategy and the life history of ducks versus geese. So to kind of sum it up, if you're a duck, you've got a lot of disadvantages when you're out on the ground, and the odds are against you. If you take, say, 100 duck eggs or 100 nests, and you say, okay, you know, a really good survival rate on a nest is, say it's 50%, which is astronomically great. So half your eggs are gone. And then to get from hatching to brood rearing, 50% there, man, that's great. Well, you're down to 25 nests or 25 eggs. And then you say, okay, for that bird to fledge and to migrate south into unfamiliar territory and spend the winter down there, all the dangers, power lines, hunters, whatever that happens to be, and make it all the way back as a breeding adult, you're lucky if half of those birds make it back. And if you've got a 50-50 sex ratio, which is pretty typical in most animal species, all of a sudden you're looking at only a handful of ducks under ideal conditions that make it back as breeding adults. So we actually consider 15% nest success, which the converse of that is 85% nest loss. We consider that an even population, a stable population, so the numbers aren't great. So these guys have a lot of challenges. So the more that we can do to keep the habitat on the ground, keep those wetlands intact, keep the big blocks of grassland, the easier it's going to be on the duck species. So this is one of my favorite slides to show to a group of ranchers. So I'll say, all right, I bet you not one of you can name 2 duck species. Now I know you, unless you're a rancher, sir. I see a bird shirt. I don't see a cowboy hat. Okay, so for ranchers, I'll say, bet you can't name 2 of these. Mallard, that's like, okay, what's the second one? You know, ping, you can hear a pin drop. So, but I'll say, okay, what about this one? And they're like, oh, well, that's, you know, a Holstein and a Black Angus and a Guernsey and a Hereford and a Scottish Highlander and a Texas Longhorn. And all right, bonus points. If anybody, I call it the Oreo cow, but anybody, does anyone know what that is? Yes, ma'am. You got it. Oh, man, I love it. Okay, I brought a special gift, and there are no little kids in the room, right? Okay. You get the stress-relieving squeeze duck as a souvenir of your extensive knowledge of cattle breeds. Oh, that is great. I had to look it up on the internet when I took that picture up near Polson, and it's like, oh, and my girlfriend says, oh, that's the Oreo cow. And it's like, no, they don't call it the Oreo cow, I guarantee it. So anyway, but the bottom line is, so you got 7 species of ducks, 7 species of cattle. It doesn't matter why we're conserving this. And this is always the next slide that I show. It's like what we need is grass and water on the landscape. We're going to have great habitat for birds, wetland obligate, grassland obligate birds. We're going to have cattle on the landscape. It's sustaining because it provides infrastructure, it provides communities with income, family stability. So all of these programs, as much as we can gauge our activities to doing that kind of work, the better off we're going to be, and the stronger communities we're going to have, you know, keeping the Montana cowboy on the landscape. So, and these are some of the impacts that we're seeing across the northern Great Plains. You know, obviously we've got other impacts and other values out there. Flood abatement. I mean, when you start draining wetlands in the prairie pothole region and facilitating that water getting into systems like the Missouri and the Mississippi, guess what happens? We have flooding in places like New Orleans. We've got a dead zone for hundreds of square miles in the Gulf of Mexico because of agricultural runoff. Whereas wetlands, as most of us know, wetlands are filters for that sort of thing and mitigate some of the impacts of runoff and flooding. So when we look at that and we say, okay, is this the best we can do? You know, this one in Montana, you might not be able to see it in the back of the room, but there were football-sized rocks out there. The name of the ranch was the Cobblestone Ranch, and they're plowing it up to farm it. And it's not if crops fail, it's when crops fail. And as taxpayers, we all pick up that burden. We pick up that burden through different programs, disaster programs, crop insurance. Many people don't know that the U.S. taxpayer picks up 75% of the cost of crop insurance. So we, as taxpayers, insure the insurance companies that insure the farmers. So we want to be able to give them the tools to be able to make, whether you're a farmer or a rancher. And the beauty is in Montana, I love working with people up on the High Line. Most of them farm and ranch. So they get it on both sides. They understand it. And they say, hey, Granddad broke this out, but it really should have never been broken out. So we'd like to put it back into native grasses, and we'd like to restore some of these wetlands. Those are the kind of people that you want to be able to work with. Yes, sir?
Excuse me, sir. You just mentioned Phillips County. Donald Trump is now president, and he's planning Keystone Pipeline through Phillips County. Can you comment on how that affects everything you're talking about through Phillips County?
Yeah, and I don't know if that's, you know, whether or not that's going to come to fruition, but say it does. Yeah, obviously.
Pretend like
Right. Obviously, there would be.
him for a moment. And I know you're not.
Well, I won't try to imitate
Go on.
the Don, but yes, obviously there's going to be a footprint. We've got a lot of oil and gas development up along the High Line now. And without a pipeline, there's trucking, there's moving, you know, that you have to pump to get the saline, the very salty water out of the ground to get the wells to produce. So there are a lot of impacts from not.
His program isn't about the wells, it's about the tar sands in Alberta.
Right.
Building a pipeline.
Right.
Just a pipeline, not about drilling.
Right. Yeah. So yes, there obviously will be impacts. You know, there's always a chance, as we see, you know, Yellowstone River, it seems like, gosh, it was just, you know, a year or two ago that we get the pipelines under the river that break. So there are going to be those incidences. I can't say. I mean, I think that's well above my pay grade to be able to get out and fight that. But I think all of us, I mean, as far as the decisions we make as to who sits in the Oval Office and who represents us in Congress, all of those decisions make a big difference, you know, as voters.
Would the Keystone be a negative or a positive for Ducks Unlimited?
I would think that it would probably, seeing the impacts, I mean, probably the best thing would be an intact prairie that doesn't have that kind of human disturbance in it. So I think it would be pretty much a no-brainer. Now, whether I'd get up and pound my fist on somebody's desk and start wailing away. Again, our approach is not so much legislative and regulatory as it is incentive-based and working with people as opposed to that club. And there are other groups. I mean, and we've seen that in the news where you've got the Sierra Club and Earth First and all the other groups that do pick up that. And I think as citizens, if we are against something like the Keystone Pipeline, those are good groups that you could gravitate towards and say, hey, this group is going to lead that charge. Ducks Unlimited just is not that group. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Okay, great.
Appreciate it.
All right, so grassland loss in the prairie pothole region. Montana's has experienced the least loss. And again, you get to places like Iowa where there have been significant losses of grasslands and wetlands. So we're actually doing good. We've actually got a pretty good base. When you start looking at land ownership, a lot of that is BLM and state ownership. We've actually got some daylight here in Montana. But now's the time to make sure we keep those systems intact on a big enough scale that they're going to be good for all these different bird species, not just ducks, but all these different hooved and winged species that are out there that basically need these large expanses. Species like pronghorn antelope. I didn't even mention sage grouse. They were actually factored into the 22 optimal species. I didn't put the slide up there of their areas for optimal habitat. But all of those species up there are just incredible, and we still have big enough intact areas of prairie and shrublands and wetland complexes that we've got some daylight and we can actually do things here in Montana. Okay, great. Yeah, I got a couple more slides and then maybe some questions. So trends in waterfowl hunters, and I think these apply, and from your personal lives, outdoors in general. It's not just hunting, but bird viewing, fishing, hunting. Kids, I hate to sound like an old fart, but kids, they like their electronic devices and they don't like to be cold. And you get into school sports when you're, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. And then you get into the point where you're dating and, you're driving a car and all these things. So you start to see some of these outdoor adventures going away. People aren't doing that. Young people aren't doing that as much. We've had a 40% decline since the 1970s. So what are we going to do? I mean, and again, I looked around the room and it's like, man, we probably don't have, do we have anyone under 30 in here? Oh, okay, excellent. But you're too old to get a squeeze duck. Yeah, unless you're stressed out, then I could give you a squeeze duck. But so one of us in this whole room is under 30. That's kind of scary. Who's going to lead that charge? Who's going to lead that charge in the future? Whether you're a duck hunter or you just like the outdoors, like viewing birds and fishing and things like that. Who's going to be out there advocating for that in the next century? So challenge yourselves. Think about what you could do. Obviously, you've had the interest to come in here. You're probably active with Audubon. Many of you hunt and or fish. Become increasingly active. Supporting conservation groups. I know for myself personally, gosh, I'm on Nature Conservancy. I donate to them and Pheasants Forever and Turkey Foundation and Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. I'm a life sponsor of Ducks Unlimited. Get involved with those groups. Get engaged, learn the issues, and support them. It's a really powerful thing for me to get up in front of the legislature, in front of a committee in the Senate, and say, Ducks Unlimited has 6,000 members in the state of Montana. That carries some weight, and we care. We care about this. These are important. These issues are important to us. Get involved with that. Encourage the next generation, bring some kids out. Get them out birding, kids, grandkids, great-grandkids, whatever you have. Political activism. Montana's so darn easy. I mean, you can go in there and you can know your legislator and basically get some of their time and say, hey, I appreciate the work you're doing. I'm active in the outdoors, and for example, funding for fish, wildlife, and parks is very important to me. Yeah, there's all sorts of tools nowadays. Very, very powerful, very effective. Yeah, a lot of times there's great websites. You know, I'll call up as a private citizen because they kind of know me from Ducks Unlimited, but I'll call up as a private citizen if it's another issue. You know, I'm a big hunter, bow hunting, and, you know, I'm concerned about, you know, whatever it may be, wolf issues, whatever that issue may be, I'll call up and say, my name's Bob Sanders. I live in Elliston, Montana, Powell County, and I'd like to, you know, encourage you to vote this way on this upcoming issue. So get involved, get knowledgeable, and most of all, pass the word. You know, so many people, it's funny, I'll go to places and people have no idea. I just traveled to San Antonio, Texas last week to give a presentation at a real estate convention on conservation easements. And the lady at the car, the Hertz rental car, said, "Oh, Ducks Unlimited, what is that, a line of clothing?" And I said, "Well, no, actually, we're a conservation group." But, you know, pass the word. I mean, people, you know, people might think of Audubon or Ducks Unlimited. You know, Auduboners have a pair of binoculars, you know, attached to them at all times and wear funny hats with a bunch of pins. And duck hunters walk around in hip boots, you know. It's not true. I mean, we're really conservationists, but we've got to get that out there to the general public that, hey, this stuff is important. So all these things, challenge yourselves to look into that and become more active. So with that, I want to thank you for coming in. I appreciate the invitation to be able to come in from Don and the group and talk a little bit about what we do and some of the things that I hold near and dear to my heart. So thank you very much.